Okay, so we are now recording. Welcome again, everyone, to our weekly call. Good to have you all on. I'll just very briefly, as I always do, share my slides just to kick us off. Okay, so a reminder for our agenda today for the call, which is, as always, kindly sponsored by the DNS OARC organisation. And as hopefully you're all aware, the primary theme of our call today is going to be an update on DNS for EU, which Robert Šefr from Whalebone, the CTO and co-founder, will just come on in a second to give us that update, which I'm really looking forward to because I think it's a very interesting project. And then, depending on time, as always, we'll run through some of the sort of recent developments, forthcoming events, etc. And if we do have time, we'll also pick up on any other business anyone may have. So that's it by way of the program today. So pretty straightforward. So without further ado, Robert, welcome. Thanks for coming on to join us. Nearly 12 months from the last time you gave an update. I know there's been a number of milestones in the sort of DNS for EU journey in the meantime. Plus, you had your own stakeholder day a couple of months ago, I think, or maybe a month ago, certainly relatively recently, which is also good news. But anyway, the virtual floor is yours to tell us the latest on the DNS for EU project.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. And I would like to use the opportunity today, since the audience here is very technical. I would like to discuss a follow-up to what I have discussed on the last DNS org, which is our anonymization approach within DNS for EU. I'll share my slides shortly, but an update why I decided to do it on DNS org. I received quite resourceful feedback. We have incorporated that feedback, and we are basically now considering three different approaches for the anonymization, which I would like to discuss here. And I will be more than happy to get feedback here from you today. I'll start sharing, and hopefully let me. Since this is the first time I'm using Zoom on the Mac, I will have to reopen the meeting to allow it sharing my screen. So allow me several seconds to reconnect.
Of course. Give everyone a chance to just think about any questions you may have on anonymization, which, as Robert said, he did touch on at the OARC meeting beginning of last month, actually back end of October. But looks like you managed to rejoin, Robert. Hopefully you can now share your material.
Yes, I've also got the comment MacBook user, which is true. I decided to switch from Windows, not to feel old and to stick to the same technology for the rest of my life.
With all the cool kids in that case, Robert.
Okay, so you should be now able to see my screen. Yes? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Great. Let's do it. So at first, for those of you who are not aligned on the DNS for EU project, just very briefly, what is DNS for EU? DNS for EU is project initiated by European Commission and is executed by a consortium of parties led by Whalebone. We, as a consortium, we focus on three different areas. DNS for EU for public, which is going to be launched next year, a public DNS resolver with several flavors of services. DNS for EU for governments, which is already running with some governments, and we are also
the index to match those two things to one another. So the idea was, hey, I don't have data flow.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Do carry on, Robert.
Yes. So DNS for EU for government, where besides already running with some governments, we are also running multiple proof of concepts and discussing the applicability for multiple governments within European Union. This one really seems to catch the attention of most of the governments within EU. And then there is DNS for EU for telcos, to support the idea of running the European services within EU and to support the use cases and the needs of European telcos. But what I would like to focus on today is mostly the part of looking for the sweet spot of fulfilling the need of having a private DNS resolver, which is mostly for the DNS for EU for public, not only, but mostly, because the aim is to have an anonymous public DNS service, and combining this need with the need of making an actual security research on top of the public resolver, which, I mean, if you start thinking about the needs, goes actually against each other to some extent. Yeah, so we want to have anonymity. I mean, and the easiest way to achieve anonymity would simply be not to log anything. On the other hand, you have the researchers that would like to work with the logs with all the possible details that they may have. Yeah, so. And especially one part of the request from the researchers is to preserve the information about the sequences of DNS requests. Yeah, so simply dropping the information about the client, which would be one of the ideas, does not really work well for the researchers. So we decided, okay, let's look into it. Let's come up with different approaches. And let's have it public. How do we do the anonymization, and let's have it reviewed. Let's have it discussed with the community, and that's why I'm here today. So I will jump directly into the three ideas that we discuss internally. We have some of them already implemented, so that we are playing with them around. And we will have to choose and we will have to describe openly the final method that we will choose for the DNS for EU for public launch next year. I will start with the one that I have called subnet keyed hashing, and let me guide you through the details of that particular algorithm. And please feel free to interrupt me during the presentation as well. We don't have to wait for the final Q&A session. It's better if we clarify everything along the way. So the first step, the idea of the first step of the anonymization algorithm is that, as a very first thing that we do, is that we take the client IP and we completely we get rid of the last 8 bits or 80 bits of IPv6 from the client IP, and we preserve only the subnet information for the rest of the algorithm. So it's the very first step. not to preserve the client IP as an input. It's just the subnet. So that's here. In the next step, then we run this information about the subnet. We run it through the HMAC based on SHA algorithm with the key used within this HMAC being regenerated every 24 hours and being only preserved in memory on the particular resolver. So it's not even, the key is not even synchronized across the resolvers, basically to minimize the risk of the key being somehow compromised. So the IP range, the subnet is hashed by the HMAC. And we only keep half of the output, the first 128 bits of that output. So we don't even keep the whole output of the hashing. And we put that part of the output into even less because we replace the first 4 bytes of that output with this prefix, which is a prefix of a documentation subnet for IPv6, and we create a placeholder string that is that looks like IPv6 address, which is however based on the output from the hashing algorithm. And last but not least, even after this process, we are still worried that we may see some subnets with small volume of DNS traffic, basically with single user, single IP address that will only send several queries per day, which would result in the logs. It would be quite limited, and such sequences may contain something that may point anyone to the actual user. Let me give you an example. It may be a domain using the actual name of the user. Yeah, some people have domains bearing their names, so that may be somehow identifiable. If we see very small sequences, for example, less than 100 logs per day, we would simply drop them out of the dataset as a last step on daily basis to limit storing anything that may be identifiable long term. And to give you a particular example of such an algorithm, how does that look like? Because it's maybe too difficult to imagine. So this is the IPv4 of the client. We get rid of the last 8 bits. So we only basically keep the subnet /24. Then we run the HMAC, the keyed HMAC, but we only keep the first half of the HMAC output here, and we replace the 4 bytes of that output to get the final IPv6 representation for the log for the researchers. Basically the same method is then used for the IPv6. So that's the first approach that we are now thinking about as a candidate for the final anonymization approach. The second one, with the cryptic name, module of IP keyed hashing, I will guide you through the actual process. So one of the main differences is also on the very beginning of that algorithm. It is that we are actually taking the whole IP address into as an input. So we are not taking just the subnet, but the whole IP. All the bits are going to be passed to the HMAC hashing. Then the process here with the HMAC hashing is the very same, with the key being regenerated every 24 hours, the key only stored in memory on the resolver, no synchronization across the resolvers. So that's the very same. Yeah. And I have actually issue here. Yeah, so the result of the HMAC then is taken to very easy operation, and that's a modulo. Yeah, I have taken an example value of 1000 here. So what we do, we take the HMAC result and we run it towards modulo 1000, and please note that 1000 here is taken as an arbitrary value. I'll get to it. I'll get back to it slightly later on. And what does it mean? It means that as a consequence of applying modulo on the hash, we will basically see 1000 different values as an output. Since the HMAC will produce close to random outputs, there is a good chance that we will see the outputs evenly distributed on the values from 0 to 999 as an output here on the modulo. And again, we will map them to the IPv6 format and possibly drop the two small data sets in the output if they occur. But the chance of having these like two small data sets under a particular token is much lower than in the previous algorithm. Again, an example, because it may be slightly overwhelming. We have the IP address on the input. We are not dropping anything. The IP address goes directly to the HMAC. And the HMAC is now run through the modulo 1000, which actually limits the output to a very small number, something between 0 and 999, if we choose the modulo 1000. And we map this value to the IPv6 notation to make it easier later on to work with the actual logs. The magic here, the magic with this algorithm is choosing the proper value for the modulo, which we expect to choose based on the volume of the DNS traffic that we will see on the public resolvers, and to discuss the expectation with the researchers of how many IP addresses can we actually, of the traffic of how many IP addresses can we merge together using this modulo approach, if it can be something like 10 IP addresses, 100 IP addresses. Hard to tell at this very moment, but the value that we will use for the modulo operation will give us a very good control on the size of the individual buckets that will be the result of that particular operation. All right, and I will go to the last part, which is actually we have considered this approach using GeoIP function at certain stage, but it was advised also to us. So it's not originally our idea. It was advised to us. I kind of like it yet it may not have all the necessary features that we are looking for. But it's very easy, very straightforward to apply. Input, again, is the client IP. And the output that we would store and we would use as a token representing the client is some nearest municipality of certain size. Let's say medium-sized city in Europe, the nearest one, which would result in like aggregating all the clients around that particular city based on the geo IP database, would be merged, would be aggregated under that particular token represented by that particular city name. Very easy, very hard to reverse, since there would be multiple networks, multiple providers around that particular city, but also have some downsides. I'll get to them. Okay, so at the end, how we think about these approaches, and what do we see, how they can help, and what are the drawbacks? So the first one, the subnet keyed hashing, where we only are taking the subnet and we are hashing them with the particular encryption key, is that the risk is that we can end up with tokens represented by the IPv6 addresses at the very end with either very low or very high number of clients. So what may happen? We may see tokens that are only having a single client sending their traffic towards the public service, and there is a risk of understanding who is behind that traffic. Or on the other hand, we may also see multiple IP addresses due to network address translation, also aggregating hundreds or even thousands or tens of thousands of clients from some internet service providers, which would eventually result in too massive volume of data for the research. Basically, the researchers would lose the visibility on some sequences of some phishing and malware campaigns. Also, the other risk here is that this particular approach, this particular process, relies on the encryption keys not being leaked. In case they leak, somehow, in case they are compromised in any way, the attacker may be able to a certain extent to reverse the information up to the IP range that sent the particular query, not the particular IP address, only the IP range, but still it's something undesirable, I would say. So that's the first approach. The second one, it's very interesting. The clients and the traffic of the clients will be evenly distributed across the tokens of the which is basically the nature of modulo when applied on a cryptographically strong hashing function. Yeah, so what we would see the same number of clients and similar volume of traffic in each token represented as the IPv6 address. However, we would also combine under each IPv6 address, we would combine completely unrelated traffic. So we may end up with the traffic from a mobile device, from country A, with the traffic from broadband connectivity from country B, and there is no particular relation, which is great from anonymity perspective, but it may be very, very difficult for the researchers to deal with this particular aspect. Additionally, we don't really care much. I would even say we don't even care at all if the encryption keys leak, since there is no way to reverse the process from the modulo. It would be very, very difficult even to brute force that. Yeah, it's close to, from my perspective, this particular approach ensures very, very strong anonymity, even in the occasion that the encryption keys leak in some way. The last one, the GeoIP function, again, it has a similar features as the first one. So we can see some tokens, some municipalities that would only serve single or small number of clients, and we will definitely see municipalities serving huge number of clients, mixing up too much traffic for the researchers to actually make it actionable, and it preserves some additional information about the municipality on very high level, which from anonymity perspective, I consider downside. It's a nice feature, speaking of like some high level reporting and understanding what's happening in the network. But from anonymity perspective, it's not really desired feature. And that's basically it. We are now still progressing with some testing, also simulating the performance impact of this, since this is happening directly on the resolver. We want this to be as fast as possible, not to create additional overhead, and not to open some denial of service opportunities for the attackers. And now I would love very much to hear your feedback, answer to any questions.
Thanks, Robert. So reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question, raise your virtual hand by pressing the react icon, it should be towards the bottom of your Zoom window, or put something in the chat if that's easier, or if all else fails, just unmute and talk when nobody else is. But perhaps whilst people are thinking, I'll give an immediate reaction, Robert, almost as a straw man for you or other people to shoot down. I guess I'd be sort of, given that this is to facilitate research, I think that's the primary premise for wanting to do this at all, I'd lean towards something which incorporated some indicator of geography in some way. Noting obviously it's carrying across some information about the user, but providing you sort of drop anything with less than so many sort of people in the category to try and preserve privacy. I would have thought from a research point of view, being able to note differences in activities between cities, between countries, etc., would be the most attractive thing, rather than if there was a valid reason for not doing that, then the modulo option looks by far the most anonymous. So I would have thought it's between those two would be my suggestion. But as I say, from a research point of view, I could see why people would favour the sort of geo indicator as part of a solution if possible. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, or indeed if anybody else on the call wants to jump in with anything, in which case either feel free.
Thank you, Andrew. And let me react briefly. What I haven't mentioned, maybe it's important part of the puzzle, what we envision is to store the country information along with the logs. Yeah, in all the cases. Yeah, mostly for high-level reporting purposes, to be able to share what's happening in individual country. But we only envision the part of like storing the country, and the municipalities. It's a different kind of detail and topic.
Okay, so you'd always have, I don't know, Germany, for example, that would always be known, but this is going down to, I don't know, Dusseldorf to randomly pick a German municipality. It will be the extra granularity that you'd gain with that approach.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. Right, I don't know if anyone else, perhaps with more knowledge of this area than I have, has any thoughts at all that you want to chime in with.
Even a reaction too technical MacBook user is okay for me, and will be happy for it to aim better for the next time.
See, Eric's popped a question in the chat. Could you share what limitations are placed on researchers? Oh, okay, that's a good question. Who've got access to the data about what they can do with it? So I don't, have you got that far yet, Robert, in your thinking in terms of who will have access and what limitations would be placed on them?
Yes. So we have at the moment, we only work with the researchers within the consortium. Yeah. So those are the consortium members. We have basically we have imposed the security requirements on them, on what we expect. Speaking of security, working with the data. And also definitely we have imposed the expectations on how they can deal with the data, and we don't share the data further on. But as we will have more data, what we expect that we will be open to requests for other research partners. And again, we will impose the same security requirements on them, and which will be on contractual basis. Plus, we want to share data with parties where there will be a positive impact on the security within European Union. So to basically again. To contribute back to the original aim of the product, to increase the security, network security within the European Union, and also the availability of similar critical infrastructure services. So that's our aim. Since there is no traffic from the public resolvers at the moment, we haven't opened such a channel as of yet. But we expect we will open it as we will be confident with whatever data we see, and we will be confident that it's anonymous enough and we can actually share something.
Yeah. Yeah. Eric, does that cover your question? Or have you got any follow-ups to that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there are restrictions.
It will not be a public data set. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Thanks for the question, Eric, and for the response, Robert. Anyone else got any immediate reactions on whether you think there's a good answer from those three choices, or whether they're all three are deeply flawed and the team have missed something completely, and they should do it differently? You could just give you a chance to sort of chime in if you do have any strong feelings either way.
I have a random question, which is maybe related. I'm curious to know, I understand that many ISPs are getting requests from some of the big cloud content providers as a condition appearing that you provide EDNS client subnet identifier information. I'm just curious to know if It would seem to me that obviously you would not be willing to provide that if that has been an issue.
We don't expect to provide it. At the moment, it's the current state.
Do you have direct peering with content providers?
No,
Okay.
no.
So that's probably an answer to that. I mean, they can't
Or-
require conditions on peering if you're not peering with them, so.
I understand. First of all, we don't want to. We haven't even opened the topic that we would be passing. The client sent that indication. Therefore, we did not investigate anything further in that direction.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Vicky. And from memory, I think some of the CDNs themselves, certainly historically, I don't know if it's still true, wouldn't in turn pass on that data even if they received it, which caused some concerns with some of the ISPs in terms of optimizing some of their routing. But anyway, that's a different discussion, maybe not one to do with DNS for EU. Again, I'll just pause to see if anyone else has got any other questions or comments or questions for Robert immediately. I suspect a few people may wish to take it away to think about it.
I would be very happy if you reach out to me directly. Anytime later, even after org, it happened that after a few days, someone sent me a message. I would be very happy for that.
Yeah. Are you happy to share the slides, Robert?
Should I send it to you, Andrew?
Yeah, if you do, then I'll share it round because I think it's a sort of topic where probably people will want to give it some proper thought. Firstly, and so reflect on it before, and then give you some feedback.
Will do. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I can see Vicky's popped something in the chat. I think the CDNs are driving the requirement for so much geo IP information more so than the ISPs. An unfortunate trend from a privacy perspective, indeed. Well, I guess from what we've heard, they won't get that from Robert and colleagues, at least, which is a good thing. And Eric, I see, has posted a comment in the chat. Again, I'll read it out loud and see if there's a need for a response immediately. For the above precursor, passive DNS, we have had some operators wary of the potential for regional information about where the data came from. For example, people in one region might look at explicit content compared to others, and a researcher may make that public. So there might be some wariness about geolocation being a component of anonymisation. Yeah, I suppose that.
It's a very good point. Yeah, very, very nice point. Thank you, Eric. Actually haven't thought of that, and I believe it makes sense because this topic actually that you described, Eric, is completely out of scope. So it's the DNS for you definitely is like a security focused. We don't want to provide any insights on what are the likings, not even like the explicit content, basically anything. So that's a very good point.
The sort of easy column just before Christmas for a journalist to write something quickly that says, people in Berlin are more likely to watch porn than people in Dusseldorf or whatever. So yeah, as you say though, Robert, your emphasis is much more on security. So hopefully we'll avoid that sort of trap in the first instance. And I've no information, I hasten to add, on the preferences of people in Dusseldorf, Berlin, or indeed any other city in that regard. Brilliant. Okay, well that was really helpful. And if you are able to share the slides, and then hopefully people will give a chance to reflect and come back to you with their considered thoughts, that'd be much appreciated. Lovely. Okay, well let's let's move on then. So really good to hear about some of the more sort of detailed sort of considerations as very much DNS for EU moves into the sort of full on into the implementation phase, as we've just heard. So I'll just go back to sharing my screen again. Which, yeah, you should now have in front of you. Okay, so I'll just briefly touch on some of the news headlines. I'll just sort of highlight some of the more interesting things to see. Starting off with NIS2, you may recall, as we've covered this a couple of times with sort of input from Michael on a couple of occasions, the sort of deadline for NIS2 to be transposed into national law in all the 27 EU member states was the 17th of October. Many, in fact, the majority of member states have yet to do that. So much so that the European Commission is the very start of infringement procedures against 23 member states. So I guess they're probably starting that in the hope that that pushes more of them to complete the process. I think most of them are some way through it, but have yet to finish. I believe they have 2 months to respond to that process, so that might just get a few more over the line before they get through to the enforcement phase. The second one down, Centre did an interesting piece immediately post the ICANN 81 meeting a couple of weeks ago, just really sort of reflecting on some of the developments since ICANN amended the registry and registrar contracts to put additional clauses in about DNS abuse. So they've just reflected on how things have moved on based on discussions at the ICANN 81 meeting, which I thought was quite an interesting summary. And then the one at the bottom of the screen, I'll call out John Levine, who some of us will know from the ITF, has written a piece about VeriSign. It was triggered by a complaint by a couple of US legislators, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Jerry Nadler, about alleged overcharging by VeriSign for .com domains. And that led John to write quite an interesting piece looking at just some of the history, which I personally find really interesting anyway, and how we've got to where we are now. So just looking back on some of the developments, the sort of history of VeriSign in previous guises, and how it's evolved, and whether the current arrangements have led to any harm to customers purchasing sort of .com domains, and I'm sure anyone associated with VeriSign, I think the TLDR from my recollection of reading the article was that he doesn't see that there's any evidence of significant harm being caused. But as I say, my main interest was more some of the history that he covered along the way in the article. So yeah, a few interesting things on there. Just picking up on a question in the chat from Robert. Any idea what UK government is thinking about NIS2, and should we expect changes to US law? UK law. Bottom line, yes, absolutely. And as Patrick's put out, there have been already some changes to UK law for registries, but actually there are further changes in process which cover other aspects of NIS2, which I can't immediately recall the name of the legislation. Let me, I'll make a note to see if I can add that to the notes accompanying this recording. But there is a sort of UK NIS2 equivalent to augment the recent UK registries legislation. So if anyone else knows, by all means put it in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, I'll include it with the core notes. Few other bits and pieces. I won't go through all of this in the interest of time. I will mention though, second one down, second one from the top, sorry. Our good friend Jeff Houston has written a really good piece about post-quantum cryptography. Essentially, if that's a topic you feel you should know more about but have yet to actually get to grips with it, he sort of helpfully explains what it is at the sort of reasonably sort of top level, then talks about some of the more recent developments, some of the threat models, and then looks at implications for a couple of protocols, so specifically TLS and DNS-SEC, mainly the latter, which is what I thought was worth mentioning. So if you want to sort of get up to speed with post-quantum, you might find that quite a useful starting point just to catch up with. And then, yes, actually, so going back to Robert's question, the top of the slide, you'll see a link to the recent changes to UK legislation as it relates to registries. So I clearly anticipated this topic coming up. So that will give you a bit of information about the current legislation for registries specifically, but there is other stuff also looking at this too. As I said, which I'll cover later. And then also on this slide, so far there's a series of 4 webinars being lined up by ICANN and the ISPCP, Internet Service Providers and Connectivity Providers constituency. 4 so far intended to provide DNS training for ISPs. As you can see, they cover DNS-SEC 101, which was earlier today, the DNS ecosystem, ICANN and ISPCP, and then DNS-related threats running over the next few months. And apparently there will be more to be added to this list. So I'll flag those as they come up. And then various other things have caught my eye, which we won't have time to talk about today, but you can look at those at your leisure. I mean, maybe one I'll call out is third bullet point from the top. France doubling down on age minimum of 15 for social media use, so potentially putting a minimum usage age. Obviously that's over and above any terms of service from the various social media platforms, sort of paralleling some thoughts in Australia where there's legislation going through to impose age verification in a number of areas. As Vicky's just put, yes, there is. I'm not sure if that's completely law yet or if there's about a 12-month delay before it kicks in, but yeah, so it's interesting that France is similar thinking to some stuff that's currently happening in Australia. So maybe an indication of where other regulators might be going. In terms of other deadlines, probably the one I'll highlight as it's today, second bullet down, is if you want to put forward any presentation proposals for the OARC 44 meeting at the beginning of February. The deadline is 23:59 UTC today to put in. I think it's an abstract is the requirement at this stage. So if you were thinking of doing something, I remind you to get something in before the end of today so you don't miss the deadline. Yeah, and then there's some other deadlines, but they're further away, so we won't worry so much about those. Forthcoming event says a WSIS plus 20 review in London on Wednesday of this week, and then it's not so far to the IGF in Riyadh later on in the month, which if you're there, let me know. It'd be good to meet up in person whilst we're in Saudi. And then finally, in terms of topics for the call, I've not had a chance to do this properly yet, so I will reschedule the blockchain naming system abuse discussion So I'll move that to some point early in the new year. So apologies if you hope to do that next week. Just a shortage of time to get that done. So when I send out the reminder for what's coming up, don't be surprised to see that will have moved from this time next week. And then, as I said, following week, no, I'll be in Riyadh, so won't be able to do this call. But if you're in Riyadh as well, do let me know, and we can meet up at some point. Now on any other business, so I'll stop sharing. I can see that Patrick's helpfully put a quote in. Yeah, I thought something had gone through, but I thought there was about a 12-month delay before it came into effect. But I will. There was a discussion on the ISOC policy mailing list on Friday and over the weekend. Chris Buckridge posted some information which I haven't fully caught up with yet. So I'll read that post call if that's of interest to anyone. And interesting to see from Nick that there's maybe also discussions about something similar, maybe in Germany as well. So clearly it's a trend amongst regulators at the moment. Anyway, we've got a few minutes left, so I'll just stop talking there and see if anyone's got anything else that you want to raise, which may include social media bans or maybe anything else that is in your mind at the moment. And if so, just unmute and talk or pop something in the chat, whatever's easier. Maybe a chance to either type or unmute, as is your preference. Seeing any typing at the moment? No one's unmuted other than Ross, but he was unmuted anyway, so I'm not taking that. He's poised to jump in with something. Although if you are Ross, feel free to start talking.
No, it didn't have anything in particular. Just happened to have left it unmuted. I guess I was just quiet enough that nobody noticed.
Yes, very, very impressive, actually. Yes, a very well behaved home or office, depending on whereabouts you are currently. Okay, well, it doesn't look like there's anything pressing then, so in which case let's draw a line there. So thanks everyone for your time. I hope you found that useful. Look out for the slides from Robert probably later on this evening, give you a chance to reflect properly on his proposals. Thank you, Robert, for coming on to talk about that. Have a fantastic week, everyone, and look forward to catch up this time next week, but not to talk about DNS abuse on blockchain linked naming systems, but we'll have a different topic instead. So have a great week. Speak to you all then. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.